It is the early hours of the morning. It is 6th of May, and we're in Washington, D.C. Me and Kali Kriel have arrived here today as part of the second week of our tour to the United States to raise awareness and to garner support against farm murders and against expropriation without compensation. I've already said that what we say to people here depend on who they are. And I've already said that we wouldn't publish a list of everyone that we are talking with, but that we might announce some of the names that, if that person or organization agrees, for a variety of reasons. But what I would like to respond to with this video, and that's also the reason why I'm doing this in English, is to some of the criticisms that we've received. Now, you would think that if you want to gain support against the murdering and torturing of people, and if you want to gain support in a campaign not to have people's private property taken from them without compensation, then that's not really something that you would get a lot of criticism against, or criticism for, but turns out that's not the case. And we have received a lot of support. I mean, you can clearly see that. And we're not too concerned about our usual friends in the media who have lashed out against our campaign here. But the reason why I'm responding to some of the claims that have been made is not to convince them, because that would never happen, but to at least provide the answers or our position and the actual facts to those who are interested in seeking the truth and getting the proper arguments to understand what is it that we are saying and what is it that we are arguing and what are the actual facts, what are the numbers. Because clearly those our most vocal critics have no idea what they are talking about, and I will expose that now. So there's been a list of things, and I'm not going to respond to all of it, but so we've had, for example, Paulie van Wyk, I think she's with my Daily Maverick or something, who attacked AfriForum on Twitter, claiming that AfriForum is saying to the Western world, we need your help to enforce our Africanness. And then she said, their logic escapes me. Now, well, if that's what we said, that logic would have also escaped me. But what Paulie is doing is she's not responding to anything that we are actually saying. She's just making stuff up, and then she's attributing it to AfriForum, and then she's attacking her own fabrication on a public platform. And she seems to be very concerned about the fact that we are concerned about the fact that farmers are being attacked and targeted. And just the following day, she lashed out on Twitter against a person who was threatening journalists, or I think a particular journalist. Then we've had Mail and Guardian tweeting an article about an editorial or opinion piece about white genocide, and they were basically arguing that there was a marginalized fringe group in South Africa that had less than 1% support, who was able, with the help and assistance of the Ku Klux Klan and the new Nazis, to change the world's opinion regarding what's happening in South Africa. I mean, as strange as it sounds, that's actually what they are arguing. Ferial Haffajee, the editor-at-large of Huffington Post, responded to a tweet of mine, and she said, she was sort of paraphrasing a quote that I was quoting, and she said, your ideas get fat and lazy when you fail to ventilate them outside of the monochrome braai, a monolithic and ahistoric place where the narrative has never been changed or challenged. You'll be right at home in the South, she said. Now, firstly, I'm very concerned about this "you'll be right at home in the South" comment, for obvious reasons. It seems to me like a clear expression of racism. But, I mean, Ferial is someone who clearly operates within a bubble, who, as far as we know, only interacts with people who she actually agree with. And I have not once seen Ferial Haffajee, who's claiming that AfriForum should ventilate their ideas outside of their monochrome braai. I've never once seen her having to publicly defend her position on a public platform against people who were aggressively attacking her and aggressively challenging her position in the same way that she's challenging AfriForum's position. That, on the other hand, is something that AfriForum does every single day. But nonetheless. Then there was a strange piece by Pieter de Tooy, which I still don't really understand what the point of it was. But what I really want to get to is a piece that was very enthusiastically, of course, retweeted by Max de Pree, the veteran journalist, by Almine du Plessis. Now, Almine du Plessis is a professor and an intellectual. And so she took the effort to make a thread, to post a thread about AfriForum's campaign on social media. And you would think that coming from an intellectual or a professor or an academic that it would be properly researched and she would make some very sound arguments. But it turns out it's everything but that. And again, the reason why I'm responding to this is because she's making a whole series of statements that's just blatantly false or dishonest and very unacademic. And she's then attributing this to AfriForum, and she's pretending that we are saying stuff that we're not actually saying. And of course, as I said, it's enthusiastically retweeted and shared by people who would like AfriForum not to campaign against murders and tortures and taking people's private property. So the reason why I'm responding is for people who are actually interested in what's really happening on ground level and what are we really saying, for them to get the facts. And not to be misled by this very clear piece of, I guess propaganda is the appropriate word. So let's go through her thread and then I'll respond to it. Firstly, her source is a Facebook page. She provides a source, and maybe I should just put that picture up here. A Facebook page about white genocide, and this is basically the picture of the page. This is what it looks like. Then she goes on and she says, this is a thread on why I think this tour, us being in the United States, is misleading. In this thread, I assume she would wanted to say, I use AfriForum statistics and it can be found here. And then she puts a link to an AfriForum report. Much of the information used and double-checked in this thread can be found here. And then she puts that link to that Facebook page. Then she goes on. In 2006-2007, there were 74 farm murders. This includes murders on small holdings, which some people leave out of the calculation in other stats. At this rate, it will take 432 years to kill all the commercial farmers and families. So, I see, well, what she did there is she took 32,000 and she divided it by 74. Because 32,000 is the closest estimate we can get to on how many commercial farmers there are, which clearly showed to us that she doesn't understand the nature of statistics. She doesn't grasp the numbers that she's working with, because you cannot divide those two numbers. It's like comparing apples and oranges, because the one number, the 32,000 that she used, is the number of all the commercial farmers in South Africa. The 74 is a number of people who have been murdered during farm attacks, which are not necessarily commercial farmers. So, firstly, the calculation she makes doesn't make sense. But anyway, then she goes on. She says, in the same year, and this is the point that she's trying to make. So she's saying it would take, 74 people were killed on farms. Then she says, in the same year, 2,639 women were murdered. And that's horrible. But the point she was making is that it would take how many years? 432 years to kill all the farmers. But if she applies that own logic to her reference to women who are being murdered, it would take more than 10,000 years to kill all the women. So if the argument is, why are we complaining about farm murders? Because at this rate, in 400 years from now, all the farmers would have been murdered based on a flawed calculation. Why is she talking about women who are being attacked and killed? Because according to her logic, that would take 10,000 years to do. But there's a bigger problem here. The problem is the fact that an academic and a person that has a degree of influence can even make such an argument to say it would take hundreds of years for everyone to be murdered. I'm curious if Almine du Plessis would say this to Corinel, who's now raising his 2 grandchildren, who were very small toddlers, when they saw their mother, Vanessa Stafflu, being murdered in front of them on a farm, who had to hide in the closets and then run, eventually after the attackers left, had to run in the middle of the night across the farm to call for help. I'm curious if she would say it would take 400 years for all these farmers to be killed, to Mariandra Yenes, who's now raising her 4 little children alone after her husband Johan was murdered in front of her and her little girl. I'm curious if she would say that to the family of Wilhelmine Potgieter, who had to stand by and watch as her father was stabbed 151 times with a garden fork, with a panga and a machete. And then she goes on. She says, in Rwanda's genocide, between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed in 100 days. That's 8,000 per day. So basically, her argument is this is not genocide because in Rwanda, 8,000 people were murdered per day. Sort of suggesting that it's not a problem worthy of the outcry that it receives. So if 8,000 people per day were murdered in South Africa, then we would have reason to go to the United States. I'm not sure if that's what she's trying to argue or what the point is with referencing Rwanda. But then again, we know the problem with the whole genocide debate is that something is only called genocide once it's happened. And even then, there's always been a large degree of denial, especially by so-called progressive professors such as yourself, Elmine. Then she goes on to say, 13 of the 74 farm murders involved torture. Any form of torture or murder is terrible. White people being tortured by black people en masse is not supported by the stats. So she says 13 out of 74 involve torture, and then she says tortures in masse is not supported by the stats. So I would say if 1 out of 5 people are tortured, that's pretty much torture in masse. And I think the point is that 13 out of 74, it's almost 20%. It's basically 20% are tortured. And that confirms the uniqueness of the problem. That is torture in masse. But if she wants to make a point that there's not torture in masse, I could respond and I could say to her, well, let me tell you, only about the people who have been tortured in 2017, in the last year, in South Africa, in the farms around your office in Potchefstroom. Trevor Rees was tied up and he was severely beaten. He was tortured with pliers. They poured jig down his throat and they murdered him. Roger and Christine Solet were stabbed repeatedly. Their hands were bound behind their neck, their heads. They then had pillowcases pulled over, or pillow covers pulled over their heads, which was tied around their necks. They were then driven to a river, the Inzinga River, if I recall, and they were still alive, bleeding out, basically. Hands tied behind their back, pillow covers over their head, and they were dropped from the bridge into the river. That happened just the other day in South Africa. Robert Lynn was tortured with a blowtorch while his wife was firstly shot, then a piece of cloth was stuck down her throat, then she was dragged over a dirt road. They said her body looked like it had been pulled through a grater. And then she was still alive, and they took a pistol in close range and they shot two shots through her eye. Nikki Simpson just the other day was tortured in South Africa with an electric drill. She was tied to a chair and she was tortured. They drilled holes through her hands and her feet for several hours. Herman Botha was beaten with an iron pipe. He died of a heart attack during that assault. Victor and Gwen Cooks just the other day, they were stripped naked. Gwen, who was 74 years old, they asked her to choose. They said to her that she can choose whether she wanted to be raped or shot. She said she would rather be shot. Then they tortured them with boiling water and cooking oil. They dripped melted plastic over them while they were stabbing Victor. Anton Smits just the other day was burned to death on his farm. Anton Miller was forced to strip naked. He was then tied up and he was tortured with pliers. And those aren't even all the tortures that happened in 2017. So you can sit there in your air-conditioned office and you can participate in your cheese and wine philosophical discussions and complain about people who are angry about farm murders and try to ridicule these people while this is happening around you. Then she says, on these stats, and she puts up a picture of a graph by AfriForum, there was a marginal increase in farm murders after Malema sang Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer in 2010. In fact, on Tau SA's statements from 2005 to 2009, there were recorded 311 murders, while in 2010 to 2014 there were 285. Well, firstly, the graphic that she puts up, and let me show it to you, has nothing to do with the point that she's making. So she puts up a graphic about how many people are attacked and killed per year, and then she says there was a very small increase after Malema started singing Kill the Boer. He didn't even sing Kill the Farmer, Kill the Boer. He sang Dubela Ibunu. So again, there's a problem there. But let me give you the numbers, because you don't have the numbers, clearly. You're making something up. Let me give you the actual numbers. In the month that followed after Malema's singing of Dubela Ibunu, there were 18 farm attacks, and there were 8 farm murders. Now, if you compare that to the amount of farm attacks and the amount of farm murders that happened in that year in South Africa, that means that in the month that followed on Malema's singing of Dubela Ibunu, or Shoot the Boer, there was an 88% increase in farm attacks and a 51% increase in farm murders. But it's easy for you as an academic to make a claim that there wasn't really an increase without even providing any data to claim your point. Then she continues, in 2003, a committee found that 2% of the attacks were politically motivated. The rural areas are vulnerable to crime due to isolation, the police not always being able to reach the area, and the belief that there are weapons and cash on the premises. So yes, there was a committee that found that in 2003, and being an academic, I would think that you would at least take the effort to read that report and to read the findings on this issue, and to be able to see that there are certain problems with those findings. There's a whole list of problems. There's actually 10 problems, which I deal with in Kill the Boer in the book that's coming out. But let me just mention a few of them, which are supposed to be very obvious. So what they do is they have a list of what are the motives for farm attacks. I think there were 4. And then they said so many, 2% of them were politically, and they said 89% were motivated by robbery, and then there were others as well. And one of the 4 motives was intimidation. So that already is a problem. So 2% were racially motivated, and then I think 5% or something was motivated by intimidation. Comparing racial or political motivation with intimidation as a motivation already doesn't make sense. Secondly, what they did was for that study, they asked the murderers what their motives were. So that's a study basically on what murderers say their motives were when they committed these attacks. But I think the biggest problem with this study is what is known as the fallacy of the single cause. It's based on an assumption that you can only have one motive when you commit a farm attack. And then they divide them up and say, so many were motivated by robbery, so many were motivated by race, and so forth. And of course, as we know, you can have multiple motives for committing an attack. And I can give you an example. I mentioned Wilhelmine Potgieter. So Atti Potgieter was stabbed 151 times with a garden fork, a machete, and a knife. Wilhelmine Potgieter was shot through the head. Wilna Potgieter was then executed. Then they made a sign that said, we've killed them and we're coming back. And they put it up on the farm gate. And eventually the court said, well, these people were only motivated by the intention to steal. I can go on, but let's rather not. Then she goes on. In 2011, the police started a national rural safety strategy with AfriForum, also welcomed by Agri-SA. It is investigating rural safety. Its failure to curb rural crime links with a general failure to curb crime nationally. So if the failure to address farm attacks is linked to the general failure to curb crime nationally, please explain to me, what do we make of the fact that the South African government still says to this very day that there should not be a focused counter-strategy against farm attacks? So we would often hear them say, they have all these priority crimes or focused counter-strategies against rhino poaching, against copper cable theft, against gang-related violence against women and children, against cash in transit heists, and so forth. And then against farm murders, they would say, no, we're not going to do this because that would be discrimination against other people. And now you come and say, no, well, farm attacks is only part of a broader phenomenon. It's clearly not. She continues, in 2016-2017, there were 19,000 murders in general, of which 74 were farm murders. Proportionally, no other murders get as much coverage in the media. No other murders get as much coverage in the media, especially the Afrikaans and the international media, as farm murders. Well, I mean, that's just blatantly false. That's simply not true. Again, you don't provide any source for what you are saying. But let me give you the numbers, because you clearly don't have them. So, vigilante incidents, such as the coffin case and so forth, is reported on average. There are 10 times more mentions per incident than there are for farm murders. So that alone refutes what you are trying to say. But then you can divide them up according to black on white violence and white on black violence. And we have those numbers. You clearly don't. So white on black incidents on farms, white perpetrator, black victim incidents on farms are reported 16 times as much on average in the English media than farm murders. And in the very balanced Afrikaans media, it's reported 6 times as much. In the English media, since you are dividing them up between Afrikaans and English, the Kulini incident had 302 news reports. It was reported 302 times in the media. The coffin case was reported 289 times. 148 farm murders combined were reported 298 times. So these two incidents together received twice as much media reporting as 148 farm murders. But you feel that you can take the liberty to claim that farm attacks are being reported disproportionately. Then she says, most of the attackers are black, demographics. Most of the victims of murder are black, demographics. She's sort of explaining that demographics is the reason. On the definitions, murder and torture perpetuated by white men do not fall under the farm murder statistics. So, if it's demographics, are you saying that black people make up 100% of the population in South Africa? Because black people make up 100% of the farm murderers in South Africa. How do we explain that? And I'm only responding to you claiming that that it's only demographics. We know there's been thousands of farm attacks. We know of one case where one of the attackers, one of a group, was an Indian male. Other than that, 100% of the attackers, as far as we know, are black males. And then you talk about murders and tortures by white men. I would really appreciate you telling me where those tortures took place. Who were the torturers and where did it happen? In 2016 and 2017, there were more than 1,000 farm attacks in South Africa. Do you know how many incidents of violence there were? I'm not talking about tortures. Incidents of violence committed by white people on farms during those 2 years. According to the media, we went through more than 2,000 news reports. There were 16 incidents, as opposed to more than 1,000 farm attacks. But again, you can claim that these attacks are disproportionately reported. Then you make a point, you say personal stories or close proximity to incidents is scary and sad. People's lived experiences should not be overshadowed by data. It highlights our own vulnerability. But to solve the problem, it must accurately be diagnosed. Well, that's a typical postmodernist reaction by an academic who so desperately wishes to prove a political point but cannot find the data to back it up. Yes, people's emotions are important and people's feelings are important. But they need to be backed up by some form of data if you want to influence public policy, or if you want to direct or change public policy or public reaction to a particular crisis. You have at least to be able to say what the numbers are, what the statistics are. Don't come with this thing that people's personal stories shouldn't be downplayed by data. Because if we do this, we're going to create a very skewed narrative in South Africa. Then she says, white people, especially Afrikaners, who try to speak out are often branded a traitor to their nation. Speaking out against farm attacks, I assume. White people are not a homogeneous group. We differ, our opinions differ, our views on white genocide differ. Who's talking about white genocide in the first place? Yes, we're not a homogeneous group. What's the point? So she's saying not conforming to the ANC's narrative, and a narrative that is purported by her friends, herself and her friends in the media, is so terrible that if you speak out against that narrative, then you become a traitor. Well, if that's the case, then I'll be a traitor and proud. But who are these people screaming white genocide? Well, every time the debate on farm murders comes up, it's you who are screaming white genocide. It's you and your friends in the media. It's Mail and Guardian screaming white genocide. It's Huffington Post screaming white genocide. If you want to know what AfriForum's position on white genocide is, you can read my book. It's coming out soon. And then you can criticize and attack AfriForum based on AfriForum's views and not on a straw man that you've put up for yourself. Then she says we should guard against the dangers of a single story. So this is another take on rural crime and farm murders. It is important to have honest conversations about crime statistics, but we cannot only focus on the statistics that suit our isolated needs. Yes. And then she concludes, we should guard against comparing and ranking hurt and fears. Every person's emotions are real to them. It is their lived experience. We should hold that space for one another. Well, clearly that space is only held for a particular group of people or people who do not belong to a particular group of people. And then we should work together to find a solution. So yes, certainly, amen to that. But you need to tell that to Max de Pre and to your friends at Huffington Post. The problem in South Africa is that there is a hierarchy of recognition. That depending on the color of your skin, if you are the victim, and depending on the color of the skin of the perpetrator, that would determine what the reaction to the story is by the mainstream of which you are a part. That's the problem in South Africa. There's a hierarchy of recognition. And farm murders are at the bottom. And yes, there's an outcry against farm murders because it's at the bottom of the hierarchy of recognition. And if you disagree with that, please explain to me why when it's the other way around, it's reported 16 times as much as when it's a farm murder or farm attack. And please explain to me why the South African government is prepared to say that they refuse to prioritize farm murders because doing so would send a message to farmers that they are special. No one's arguing that rhinos are seen to be special because there's because rhino poaching is a priority crime. No one's arguing that because it's silly. But the moment we start talking about farm murders, that's the argument. So Victor Klemper was a Jew who survived the Holocaust, and he wrote a journal about it. And in his journal he said, he was actually an intellectual himself, but in his journal he said, after the Holocaust, he said, if one day the situation were reversed and the fate of the vanquished lay in my hands, then I would let all the ordinary folk go, and then some of the leaders, who might perhaps after all have had honorable intentions and not known what they were doing. But I would have all the intellectuals strung up, and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from the lampposts for as long as was compatible with hygiene. Of course, we have no intention to harm anyone. We have no intention to harm you for making these statements. We don't even have an intention to debate you. The only reason why we do is to ensure that rational, truth-seeking people are not misled by the hatred, the bigotry, and the condescending shrugging off of the fact that we are not only being attacked and killed, but that we are being tortured. And your ridiculing of the fact that we will not accept this as normal, and that we will not stand by as spectators in a game in which we are murdered, while you are having philosophical discussions with Max de Pree and some of your friends. So we will not be discouraged by these type of attacks, but we would respond and we would continue to provide the actual data. And we are very grateful for the immense amount of support that we have received from our members, from public at large, and particularly also from the people here in the United States who we have been speaking with. Signing out.